Today on Triumph Talks, I'm welcoming back an author who's been on the show quite a few times as we've discussed his book, A Boy from Cracker's Neck, which is on the shelf right above me, and his grandfather, who was a B 17 bomber pilot during World War II. We've spent most of our interviews focused on those amazing stories, especially as Masters of the Air series came out. In fact, John and I have another YouTube channel dedicated to talking about bomber pilots and pilots of different war eras called Masters of the Air. But today we're coming back to his book and we're going to put a focus on the fact that his grandfather grew up in a small coal mining town in Appalachia, where a lot of very important and interesting history occurred. John, thank you for coming back.
Well, my pleasure. I'm glad to be back, and I'm really happy about today's subject because today talking about what my granddad, his early life in Appalachia, and really during the Great Depression, because that was really one of the reasons I wanted to put my book together, was to kind of tell that complete story of the greatest generation in World War II. Because it's not only about my granddad. I had other characters that were in World War II, veterans of World War II, and I wanted to kind of highlight of when you say, oh, they were tough men. Well, what exactly made them tough men? And I was very fortunate to hear their stories growing up firsthand, and so we'll talk about it as we go along here. But
Yes. So this episode we're focusing on the parts of your book that come from sort of before the war, mostly as your grandfather grew up in this culture that people are getting more and more interested in for all sorts of reasons, and that is the mountain folk of Appalachia. So let's jump into some of the interesting things. The first thing I'd like to do, if you could, is just can you give us a little history of Appalachia itself? Where did the people come from, and what got those little towns established?
yeah, and the history I'm going to talk about is the one that I know personally, and that's really the history of the coal fields. And what's a little bit what people don't really recognize about the coal fields of Appalachia, and whether that be Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, going all through West Virginia. And of course, you had coal fields in Pennsylvania and going all the way down to Alabama. But what most people don't realize, we're not rural in the traditional sense of rural like out west, where people just went to settle to farm. Most of the time, they went out west to own land. Well, the coal fields, and you take like Big Stone Gap in particular, we were more of a boom town. Prior to King Coal, there was very few people that lived in this region, Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky at all. And if you go back into the 1600s, 1700s, it was pretty much a hunting grounds for Shawnee and for the Cherokee. And it wasn't even settlements here by the Indians, but they were hunting grounds. So they spent time here. So there were very few
Oh,
people that actually
that is
lived here at
that
all.
is interesting. So even the Native Americans didn't actually live there,
Lived
but
there. No, but
why
they
is
might
are
they
there
might
some
have hunting
challenges?
camps. Well, because first of all, it was good hunting ground, but it was very mountainous. I mean, to get
Mm,
from point A to point B was a struggle. So
well,
it
that
was
makes sense.
very, very tough terrain, and but great hunting grounds for the Indians and stuff. And
Hmm,
the as far as the settlers that came in, a lot of them were Scotch Irish. It was probably the only place out west that when the Irish came over, it was early 1900s. Nobody wanted them. They were enacting laws to try to keep them from coming here. So as they migrated, they eventually ended up in an area that nobody else wanted, which was deep Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky. So that's where you had the original settlers of the Scotch Irish. And then, of course, in the early 1900s, it was just they knew coal was here, but until they got that first railroad here, that's when it boomed. So you
okay,
went from
so
yeah,
the settlements, like you said, were just around the coal field. So we have a picture
yeah,
that's from your book that
mhm.
shows, one of these coal mining towns. Wanna share a little bit
And that's
what we're looking at?
that's the Stone Egg coal camp with Stone Egg Coke and Coal, and that was their workers' houses in a coal camp. Looks across the street, maybe a couple stores. And these coal camps were very self-sufficient. I mean, they had stores that they were company stores now, and we can talk about that later, what that meant. They had theaters, and they also had like hospitals. So their own little communities. Some of these coal camps had several thousand people living in them. So they were
Wow.
very large towns at that time.
Yeah, for that time, for that
Yeah,
era, that's a lot. And I know that we're observing as we look at this picture, these houses actually don't look a whole lot different than some of the cookie cutter neighborhoods that you would even see today. It's very clean, and the
modern for that
architecture
time.
seems a
Yes.
little more modern than what you normally see from the early 1900s.
Yeah, and that was a little misnomer people outside the region didn't realize. And this is a classic example of a boom town. This picture
Mm,
is after World War II, and how many people flocked here to get good paying jobs. And of course, the union. We'll talk a little bit about the union.
mhm.
Helped get those wages up, helped get health care, helped get the 40-hour work week eventually. This particular picture is of a coal temple, and this is actually where my great granddaddy, who's in the book, actually worked as a manager of the coal temple. And what that does is that the coal would come out of the coal mines. You can see some shafts in the background, and this facility would load the coal onto rail trains, rail cars on the trains, coal trains.
And a lot of children worked in the coal mines during this time.
As you can imagine, this is pre-union days right here, and
Mhm,
there's no child labor laws. And
mm.
one of the dark sides of the coal industry was 60 to 80 hours a week was common. You worked 6 days a week, and where you lived in company housing, if the husband, in this case, got killed, the only compensation they would have is they would offer the job to the oldest son
Oh,
to replace him so they could stay in the house.
which really
So
makes it all the more tragic in a way. The poor
yeah,
child has
so
to go to work now.
and what's the old saying? It was the best of times, worst of times. That's exactly it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
It was offering, employment. It offered cash wages. It offered nice housing, some health care, which these men were coming from all over the world searching for that. But now the working conditions in the mines pre-union was pretty bad because life was pretty cheap. And of course, some of the chapters we talk about that.
Yeah, you tell some really interesting stories that show how little they actually valued the, mules
Yes.
more than the humans, which
And
it's
that was
hard
a
to see.
story my granddad told me that came from his granddad firsthand, and
Mhm.
it kinda and show I mean, the quote from the superintendent was he was more concerned about those what happened those ponies that got killed in the
The
mine to those
ponies.
men because it
Yeah.
was gonna cost them $2 to $3 a head to replace the ponies. Wasn't gonna cost them nothing to replace those men because they were lined up at the, co office for those jobs already. There's people lined up to replace those men.
And that's how life was. I know another thing you highlight in your book really well is the amount of poverty
Yes.
that people actually were going hungry, or children
Yeah.
were regularly going hungry and going without shoes, such that by the time they got, I don't know, that drafted or they signed up to go fight during World War II, it was the most prosperous they'd ever felt. So,
Yeah, I mean, we can read about it in history, but throughout the Great Depression, especially rural areas, I mean, to imagine 50% of the population of America was going hungry daily, and to imagine, and I
that
write about some true
yeah,
characters in my book that when they woke up, their whole emphasis that day was just trying to find food for the day,
yeah,
and
life
as my
has changed.
yeah, and my granddad would talk about they were poor, but they were not hungry poor. There was two types of poor. He said,
Mhm.
"Son, everybody was poor." He said, "We didn't know rich people." And he said, "Everybody was poor, but there was two types of poor. There was hungry poor, and we were just poor with no cash money. And there's a big difference."
Big
Uh,
difference.
yeah,
Yeah, it's remarkable, and then, of course, you talk about the cost of a child being born, what that was.
yeah. One thing I heard all the stories not only from my papa, but from his peers that would come by the farm pre World War II was just how much of our economy was barter, and especially in rural America and then throughout the mountains. And when I say barter, if you didn't have money, you had to trade for services. And one of the stories that he talked about was his older brother. When he was born, the doctor that came by that delivered him got paid with a bushel of corn. And by the time my papa was born, the price had gone to 2 bushel. And of course, his older brother would kid him about, well, he was a 2 bushel baby. And then, they had a whole network of, if you worked on the farm for a week, a feeder pig was a week's wages. But, they had this whole barter system. And if you ever watch old reruns of the Waltons, the early episodes were a lot like it. They went to the store and they traded. They took stuff to the store owner to trade.
Mhm.
And,
Such a different
you
way.
know, it was just funny to hear. And my granddad would talk about it. He was probably a young teenager before I ever laid eyes on paper money. Now you'd see some coins every once in a while.
Wow.
He said, I have no memory of ever seeing paper money, which was a dollar or more.
Wow.
Um, till he was a teenager.
That's amazing, and that I think that shows just how much life changes. Kind of along those lines, a story that you have in the book that is one of my favorites just of that era is the experience of having their first night football game for the high school.
Yeah. Of course, my grandfather was a real good football player, and he could, as you know personally, because I've told you enough of him, he loved telling stories, and he could tell stories about football games and stuff. And the one that he loved to tell was that first, and this is actually a daytime football game at his Eastone Gap High School,
But
but he loved
that's the
yeah,
fields that, a lot of those games were played on back in the time, yeah.
oh
Look
yeah,
at that, there aren't even any stands. People are
oh no, no, and these were local high schools and stuff like that. But the first night game, he said we were so excited. He said a night game, and it was against a district rival and stuff. And he said we got there, and he said, son, but the local grocery store's parking lot was lit better than that football field. And it was actually a true story that
So
they
this was
went
the
out.
first time they had actually lit the field, but it was
Yeah.
not very light.
Oh
Okay.
no. And it was so dark that
Yeah.
they went out and got some white paint and painted the football so they could see the football. Uh,
And it
and
it
played
was
with a
right before
painted.
the game, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, just stories like that I heard, and then like the other World War II veterans would stop by and talk about their high school experiences growing up on the farm, and of course, one of my favorite characters and one of my favorite people on earth at the time when was Bertel Staller,
Mm,
and a character. Oh my goodness,
mm.
he was a tough, tough man. And of course, I talk about a little bit what made him so tough was that man grew up hungry, and
So Virgil Stellard really comes into your book
yeah,
when he is met in Europe, and he
yeah.
was he part of the landing on D-Day or
Yes, he
something?
was.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's what I thought, and he was
and,
tough, tough, tough. Big
yeah,
man, really big for that time.
especially for that generation, 6'3",
Mhm,
6'4".
mhm.
Even when I knew him in his, 70s and 80s, he was still standing probably 6'2".
Yeah.
And, just I mean, huge hand. You could tell how much he'd worked when he was young and stuff. But anyway, I have to tell this quick story.
Yeah.
I couldn't put it in the book, but it was after Saving Private Ryan came out. And there was some news reports how a lot of the World War II veterans were having PTSD flashbacks and stuff. And
Wow.
I saw his wife Ilo in the grocery store, and I asked her, I said, "Have y'all seen Saving Private Ryan yet?" And she said, "Oh yeah, we saw it last weekend." And I said, "Well, you mind if I stop by and see Coach?" And Bertrell Stallard was
Mm.
a local high school coach, so I called him Coach. So I stopped by, and I kind of eased into the subject because I wanted to make sure he was comfortable with it. And he just looked at me straight in the face. He said, "Son, that movie was exactly the way it was." He
Wow.
said it was like being there. And then I
Mm.
was like, "Well, I mean, did it bother you any?" And he just looked at me with no bravado, no ego, as serious as a man could be. He looked at me. He said, "Son, let me tell you." He said, "The only thing I can tell you was the day after, I'm sitting in a foxhole with plenty to eat and brand new boots on my feet." He said, "If it wasn't for all the shooting and killing, it wasn't bad at all." And
Yeah,
unless you knew how hard he grew up, you would think that was just some over the top bragging statement. But
yeah.
if you know how hard he grew up hungry, you understand
It's
what prepared
remarkable.
him for that
Yeah,
war.
it is absolutely remarkable. I think it says a lot about what being constantly hungry does
Yeah,
and the poverty. The other thing you talk about in your book as well as the poverty is the amount of violence that actually existed in those early days.
yeah. And this goes back a little bit to my great grandmother that we call Little Granny in the book.
I'm
And
gonna bring her picture up. Let's
okay,
see
yeah,
her.
that's her, of course, on the left.
Uh,
Oh, she was 4'10". She's a little bitty thing, and born in 1897, but had a great memory of detail. Didn't embellish stories. I mean, when she told you something, it was straight on the way it was. And what we don't realize is in today's society, we have law and order. I mean, the police is just a 911 call away. Chances are they're not that far away from you and stuff. But in the era that they grew up, first of all, there's no telephones. And second, very few police. I gave the statistics about Wise County, which is where Big Stone Gap is in. In the 1930s, it had boomed to like 50,000 people lived in the county because of the COVID. And they had in Big Stone 3 police officers. That included the chief. You had a daytime deputy and a nighttime deputy. And the county only had 6 officers for a whole county of 50,000 people.
mhm,
So there was very, very little law. And
mm.
then there was, of course, back then, and with the coal industry, there was a lot of bars, a lot of drinking. Alcoholism was rampant. That's one reason why we had prohibition and stuff,
Oh,
because
yeah.
alcoholism was so bad. And with alcoholism, you had violence. And of course, I write about the violence that just happened at their church. And my granddad would make a statement. This was the little church, Big Springs church, and it's still standing today. It's not an active church, but the building's still there. And there was 2 murders. One was on the stoop, and one was on the inside. And of course, that was personal grievances. One was over property, and one was over a woman. And but that was my granddad was make a statement. He said, "Son, I don't remember anybody I even graduated with that hadn't witnessed a violent crime."
Yeah.
And, you know,
How many of us can say we've all witnessed a violent, if
yeah,
not more than
and
one
I'm
violent crime?
glad that's very low. I hope nobody. I hope a lot of people, but back
Yeah.
then there there was very little law, and most of the time the law was what you could protect yourself.
Right.
So
Murders at church. That's a phrase. I think that was the chapter title in your book was Two Murders at Church. And
yeah.
it just even here one murder at church would seem super odd, but that just goes to show how different those
Oh,
timelines.
let me tell you a little story about that I might not have told you was my
Mm,
papa's sister, Aunt Jenny, lived to be 97. She actually just passed away a year and a half ago. And we went to visit her in her assisted living, and she'd been watching 24-hour news, talking about, oh, son, how terrible the world was, how violent it was. And I said, Aunt Jenny, I just wrote about y'all had 2 murders in your church. And she just thought for a second. She goes, huh, I guess we did.
wait.
Well, it might not be so violent today as what I thought. Yeah.
And then you have a chapter titled Pistol Across the Gym Floor, which happened during a basketball game. Here's a picture of an actual team from back in the 1930s from that era and that area.
Yeah. And this is the same decade my granddad graduated, and that was East On Gap High School, where he went to high school. And
Mm,
yeah, and it's just such a funny story that I just wanted to put in a book and kind of showed that era of even a lot of the teachers carried weapons. Back
mhm.
in the book I'm writing right now, I'm getting ready to release goes. There's actually a true story of a teacher that had a gun. Probably late 70s, early 80s. So it was a lot more common than what people think. And
Yeah.
anyway, the story and it falls out. And my granddad could tell that story because he said, if you want to hush 1,200 yelling fans, he said, let a big heavy metal revolver hit the wooden floor and just slide across. And he said, even if you've never heard that sound, when you hear it, you know what it is. And
You know what's
he
happened.
said, but you could have heard a pin drop.
I just I just find it so remarkable how different life was, and of course, I think we get nostalgic about the good old days, and your grannies even had to set a preacher straight who was doing that. She's like, those were not the good old days. I would not go back to them. So,
Yeah, and that's not to say they didn't have fond memories. I mean, of course they
mhm.
had, great things. There's a great documentary out right now. It's streaming. You can find it called The Mayberry Effect, and
Hmm.
how it's kind of done a disservice to our memory because Mayberry did not show the violence, did not show.
Yeah.
what was going on in the bigger world. Now, of course, it's a feel good show. They wanted you to laugh. They wanted you to feel good. But my grandmother was very quick to point out if you want to say, hey, the 50s were the good old days or the 60s. I mean, she talked about the Korea War. She talked about segregation. She talked about the draft in both those wars. She said there wasn't nothing good about those decades I want to go back to.
Yeah.
And you go back to the 40s, World War II. You want to go back 30s to the Great Depression. You want to go back to the 20s. I mean, she said she just went on and on. She said, "What decade do you want to go back to?" And she said, "I'm
Yeah.
not going back to those times."
She's been
And
there, done that, and she knows it's
yes,
not. Those
and
of us that
I
didn't
put
live through it, we just get the, like you said, the Mayberry, TV show references to think about
a
the
great
past.
show. We're not knocking
No,
Andy
yeah,
Griffith here, but
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 yeah,
it
we're
is
all
a feel good show.
we think
And
we have it so hard today, and so
yeah,
I think it
so
helps to be able to be more realistic about it's not to say there aren't problems today that didn't exist then. Of
yeah,
course, we've got technology problems like crazy, but it's really interesting to kind of hear from the people that were there what they think about that idea of it being the good old days. Talk to me too, because we're really focusing on Appalachia.
yeah.
It's a fascinating area. A lot of folklore comes from that area. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, even today, it's one thing that's always fascinating. We had a farm supply store on our farm here. We would have some Lungin families from over in Eastern Kentucky coming by. I remember going to their place. So, I've written a little bit about that in the Keoki Triangle book and the upcoming book, Ghost of the Moonshine Mafia. And, did a little bit on folklore with granny women. Now, back in the day, they called them granny witches, but we kind of call them granny women today. And those would be kind of like medicine men. They were herbal, and they were mixed coming all the way over from the Celtic region of Scotland and Ireland with herbal medicines, and then they came and kind of got infused with the Cherokee and the Shawnee and some of their medicines and stuff. And even in the 80s, there was local doctors here that would recommend you go see a granny woman for certain conditions and stuff because know, it worked.
So
And
you write
not
about
there's
that?
no magic in this. That's another thing. We're not
Yeah.
talking about magic, but we are talking
Mhm.
about gifts and gifts of herbal and more earthly
And
type of
it's the
medicine.
culture. It's the
Yes.
culture of Appalachia that they would have their own type of medicine woman, and you write
Yeah.
about that in your second book, which is I'm gonna love to share that based on some folklore that's
Yeah.
probably true, but you told the story the way that your imagination tells it, called the Keoki Triangle, and that's where you do introduce us to a lot of the culture of Appalachia, as well as the story that people have been talking about that you put to some detail here. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And some of these stories, a little bit of imagination, but a lot of them came from personal experiences of people I met in Keoki. The chapter talking about going and buying the coon dogs, the Walker dogs from Lunch and Family. That actually was my son's grandfather. I went with him. He bought those. Those people were real.
Mm,
So I just kind of put it in that story and stuff.
mhm.
Fascinating people, very isolated. And they choose to be. Um, just
But not as well, let me pick my words, not as unintelligent as they're reputed to be, right?
yeah,
They're very
and that's one reason, when we talk about being hillbilly. Okay,
yes.
at my insurance office, we had a gentleman called Dr. Ralph Stanley, who in the bluegrass circles is real famous. And
Mm.
Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That was a lot of his music. And Oh Brother,
Oh,
yes, so
yeah.
you know him even without knowing his name.
Huh.
And I remember one time he was in my office, and I asked him, Mr. Stanley, I said, what's your definition of bluegrass? And this goes with hillbilly too. He said, I can't define it. I just know it when I hear it. And the
Oh.
same thing about hillbilly. What is hillbilly? What makes a book hillbilly? It's hard for me to define it, but I know it when I read it. You
Hmm.
just because the, like I say, that hillbilly culture, Appalachian culture, you have to really live it to know it because on face value, it's very like Kyoki. don't know how many characters, you if you looked at them, you thought they were a poor joker that you might need to lean money to buy lunch, but yet they were rich enough to buy a Ford dealership out. And that's a
Yeah.
true statement. I had customers exactly like it.
Their
Um,
values, their
yeah,
values are so
what they
different, which is
choose, and like
yeah.
the character that lived in a single wide trailer and had a Ferrari and a helicopter. That was one of my personal customers.
Wow. So
I mean, that
that's
was
one thing I love about that book too, because it's very funny. I read it out loud to my daughter when I was working on your manuscript, and I was laughing so hard I had a hard time keeping, keeping it going. And I talked to you later. Where did you get the ideas for all this? And you're like, oh, it happened.
yeah,
One of them happened to you, and another was people that you knew, and so yeah, it's
yeah,
really
and I had that one customer bought the book and emailed me, and they said, "Mr. Peace, I have to ask you: Are these characters made up from a vivid imagination of yours, or are they really true?" And I had to tell 'em. I said, "Some of the names have been changed, but they're true."
yeah. So even
Um,
though it's a fiction book, it's based on so much truth that you can read it and really say, okay, I have a really good idea of what that area is like, at least from what you're able to convey in it, which it makes it really fun. And then, of course, there's another thing that Appalachia is kind of known for is the moon shining, and you see
yes.
the pictures of the stills, and you kind of hear about the fighting that goes on between the families. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course, everybody knows the feud of the Hatfield McCoys. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty famous. Now, in Wise County in particular, where I live, it wasn't corn whiskey that was moonshined as much as it was Applejack, because we had apple trees and apple orchards. And
Mm,
Applejack is hard cider with kind of an elevated alcohol level. So what was probably made around here the most was Applejack, but it's all moonshine. And then if you were blessed, you might even get some apple brandy. And that was the
mm.
liquor they would make out of apples and stuff. And of course,
Now that makes me think of our one of our favorite shows. It's also from that area, Justified.
yes,
What was her name? The woman that was the
Mags.
Megs, and she had her
Yes,
apple brandy that she'd put the
yep,
poison in, and
I
she,
know. And one
yeah.
reason we didn't have a lot of corn whiskey was it was real hard to grow corn in this part of the country. So they'd
Mm,
substitute in apples, and they learned how. And I put the joke in the Crackers Neck book. You can make more money selling corn by the quart than you can the bushel, and all of it, a lot of it was out of necessity, and that was to make a living.
yeah.
If you could make something that you could sell and make money, you did. And of course, we all know that Waylon Jennings song from Dukes of Hazzard. Good old boys trying to do the best they can, a little bit more than the law will allow. That
Oh,
was,
yeah.
that was still a big segment of our locality was people just trying to get
Wow.
by
So
and make a
interesting.
living.
So I'm gonna bring up the cover of your, as of right now, your up and coming book, which is a continuation of that Keoki Triangle saga.
Yes,
And I love this because clearly we have this the stills and the moonshine there at the front of it. So,
I had a
so
lot
you're
of fun writing that book. I hope it's a good book. We'll find out.
well, I know it's building off the same characters that we met in the first book, and so I love how you're able to just take the experiences and the culture of your area and put it into these entertaining books that give us a little bit of history, a little bit of a experience as if we've been there, and then just some great storytelling.
Yeah.
So
I had to put
yeah.
this in, one of the chapters of Keoki's a bricked up double wide. And of course, I was in the insurance business for a long time, and we had a big snowstorm, and we had some out of town claims adjusters that had to come in, and from Richmond, Virginia, from the city. And I can remember taking them by one of my customers, and it was a bricked up double wide. And the claims adjuster said, "I've never heard of a bricked up double wide. What is a bricked up double wide?" And I said, "Well, that's what it is." And she goes, "Why?" I said, "Because," and this is so true. Well, when you first get married and you're kind of poor, you live in a single wide. And if you get a better job in the mines, you move up to a double wide. And if you get even better, you brick it up.
Yeah, that like those are the aspirations of the people in that area.
Yeah.
It's very
So,
interesting.
yeah, I said, It might be unique, but it's our unique.
Now you are coming to us right now from Big Stone Gap,
Mhm.
is that right?
Well, in Crackers Neck, which is right outside, about 7
Crackers
miles
Neck,
from town. Yeah,
Crackers
Crackers
Neck.
Neck.
Yeah, and, let me just bring up a picture of the valley there that's nearby.
Yeah, that picture was probably pre-World War II,
Mm,
um,
interesting.
at black and white, and then, one thing pre-World War II, you'll notice how few trees are in the valley. If you see a modern picture of High Valley, you'll see a lot more trees
Oh,
down
that's
in.
interesting. Oh,
Yes,
because they needed the trees to put the,
firewood.
the
If
plywood in or the wood beam.
firewood, and you also built barns, so, of course, you would chop down the nearest tree, so, actually, there's
And
a
for
lot more
filling
forests
the
now than
coal
when there
mines.
was. Yeah,
Did they have the beams in the coal
yeah,
mines and
timbers, co-timbers sure did on
timbers?
that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and now you live on a farm in Crackers Neck. Of course, the title of your book is Boy from Crackers Neck, so you're just keeping the legacy going. Do you ever have any desire to leave it or
I've traveled some, well, this is where the roots are and, family,
Mhm.
and, I don't know, they talk about, some boy can leave the mountains, but the mountains never leave them, and that was true. When I lived in flat country, I tell you, it was amazing how much, growing up here, all you dream about is leaving. It's just like every other kid.
Oh,
I'm gonna get the
really?
heck out
Oh,
of town.
interesting.
Yeah. But for me personally, leaving and then realizing I really missed it and stuff. Um, and we have our drawbacks too. There's certain things I do miss. But
Mhm.
now the best thing that's happened to us here locally is having good internet, having good services and stuff
Yeah,
like that
yeah,
has made a world of difference on the
yeah.
quality of life as far as being what you would call modern
Yeah,
society.
because here's a beautiful picture of the area where you live, and I would
Oh,
say
that
that
sunrise from the farm, yeah,
looks like that's from your farm. That looks like
yeah.
a pretty good quality of life to me right there. Wow, and then, of course, you got is this a sunset?
Actually, that's a sunrise also.
Also,
Yeah,
ugh,
as you can tell, I'm a morning person, so
I love it. It's just yeah, the mist. I imagine it smells amazing too.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's from my mom's back porch in the wintertime,
yeah.
showing some of the
Well,
farm on.
so for anybody who's watching this show that tuned in because they're interested in Appalachia, what do you recommend for somebody who might like to go visit and travel that area? What should they go and see and do?
Well, luckily, I mean, Big Stone's really seeing kind of a rebirth.
Mm.
Right now, downtown probably looks better than my lifetime right
Mm.
now. We're getting a lot of the baby boomers retiring out and coming back home that left in the 50s. With one of the biggest problems with our poverty in the coal fields was that boom and bust cycle of the coal industry. It was either
Mhm.
booming or it was busted. And when it busted, it was layoffs, unemployment. We didn't have enough
Mm.
other industries to make up that gap. So when a lot of the bust would happen, we had a lot of what would be the baby boomer generations and the now generation X coming back. They moved away to the auto industry, they
Mhm.
moved away to the Midwest, moved all over the country for employment, and a lot of those
Oh,
people are retiring out. And because we do have a little less cost of living, and we have
oh,
improved internet, we have improved local healthcare. It makes it pretty attractive to retire out here. So,
interesting. So
yeah,
maybe there's
so
potential retirees that might like to
yeah.
pick your brain about coming out that way. I definitely want to go and visit. That looks so beautiful.
And like
Um,
I told my son, I said, if you love outdoor activities, whether it be hiking, hunting, fishing, stuff like that, we are paradise for those people, and we are improving on getting a little bit more of that amenities for more of the city folk, like I talked about internet. I
mhm.
grew up without cable TV. They got it when I graduated high school and stuff. So getting services like that, you don't realize quite how important that is to attract people. And
Yeah, it makes a
yeah,
huge difference in what people are
yes,
willing to where they're willing and able to move to is amazing.
yeah.
Well, this is fascinating. I've enjoyed reading your books and helping you share them in all the farms that we do.
Well, I
And
appreciate all your work and appreciate
yeah.
being on the show. And it's been real fun. I tell you what, if my granddad was alive, I think he'd get a big kick out of people enjoying his stories because he loved telling the stories. And of course, at one of the chapters when he's in court, I said, "You never gave him an audience because he'd take up 30 minutes to an hour of your time." Uh,
That
talking
is that is a great chapter in your book. It's towards the end when he, has to go in front of the judge for his speeding tickets, which
at age 88 and
80.
get up in court and brag that he wasn't driving like no old man.
I love it. Yeah. Well, I can tell that your grandfather was a great storyteller,
Yeah.
and you inherited his skills because all of
Well,
your
thank
stories
you.
are just so fun to read, and so, I'm glad that we got to do a little spotlight on the Appalachia side of your book, and, we'll put the link to purchase that book on Amazon in the comments. I will also put a link to our other YouTube channel that I mentioned a little bit. It's called Masters of the Air. And so, for anybody that's interested at all in World War II or just military stories, movies, interviews, we've got some really interesting people that are going to be coming on and teaching us a lot. So, yeah, so come join us on that channel too. And so, with that, I guess we'll say goodbye.
Thanks for having me on. Thank you.